Well, hi. Okay, let me introduce myself. Who am I? My name is Paul Gueret. I am an occupational physician, but I've had an interest in the life insurance industry for over 30 years. So that's how long I've been doing it. In 1987, I started a practice in Baggot Street, took it over from Dr. Robert Wilson, who was the CMO of an insurance company. And at the time, he told me, look, life insurance is the way forward. It's what I should get involved in. There was nobody else specializing in the business at the time. So he sent me off to the M&G in the UK, where I met Dr. Brackenridge, who was the godfather of life insurance underwriting, and I spent a couple of months with him and came back. And shortly after, started work as the CMO with one company, and then it spread on from there. So I've been in this game for 30-odd years. What do I do? Well, my day varies from day to day, but most days I spend time underwriting. I also do insurance medicals. They're a little bit bland. You get to meet interesting people, but not particularly interesting from my point of view. But the life insurance underwriting is what I enjoy. So I do underwriting and I do claims management. And I do it every day. Some of it I do from the office. Emails come in with queries, odd questions about various applicants. What am I going to do? Do I think this person is eligible or not eligible? If so, how much extra should they pay? That kind of stuff. Can I interpret this GP's handwriting? An awful lot of time spent doing that. And then on most days, I'd be on the road, on the motorbike, going to visit the various offices. You go into an office, and there'll be underwriters in a big room, and you go from table to table, and you look at all the various cases. And so what cases do I see, and how often do I see them? Well, I see them every day. Mostly, I see the complex cases. I also see some very large cases. So, if we're talking about a couple of million, and there's a stress test there, and they want me to look at that, I'll look at that. But for the most part, I'm seeing cases where there's a problem. So either an unusual medical problem or an unusual combination of problems, and they're looking for my opinion. Okay. And I suppose the one thing I've got good at over the years is I'm good at making decisions, and I make them quickly, take all the information in, make a decision, move on to the next case, because there's an awful lot of it. So who do I do it for? Most of the companies in Ireland, not all of them, but most of the companies in Ireland, I act as CMO. A couple of companies outside of Ireland, a German company, a French company, an Italian company. So I've worked in the Spanish market before. I've done some work for a reinsurance company in the past. So yeah, it's quite widespread. Okay, most of my day, however, is spent doing occupational medicine. Occupational medicine is dealing with people who are mostly out sick, and I want to get them back to work. So that's what most of my work is. I do some independent medical examinations for the insurance, but from your point of view, my time is spent underwriting and claims, and that's what I want to talk about a bit today. So, a little bit of culture first. The history of the life insurance industry dates back to the medieval period, to the guilds. So, guilds, let's imagine a small town of maybe 5,000 people back in the 8th, 9th century, and there's a guild of maybe 30 or 40 blacksmiths. And what they would have done was they would all contribute £1 a year into this kitty. And when somebody died, one of the blacksmiths died, the wife got what was in the pot. So if the money was collected for 10 years, there might be 300 quid in the pot, she got the 300 quid. That's how it works. That was the beginnings of the life insurance market. The problems you can see almost immediately were when somebody died a week later, there was no money in the pot. So if you died early, you got loads of money, or your wife did. If you died late, there might be nothing there. The other problem was if a young guy came in, a new blacksmith, and he was 22, and you had a blacksmith there who was 82, they were putting the same amount in. So obviously the young guy was going to be likely to pay an awful lot more into the kitty than the old guy who was only putting in the same amount of pounds. So there was no equity. So the basis of the life insurance industry as we know it today is equity. And by equity, I mean is you pay proportionate to your risk. If you bring to the product a high risk because of your medical history or your habits, you pay more. If you come with low risk, you pay less. And how much you pay is proportionate to the risk you bring in. And that's the whole point of the industry today. So, what am I going to talk about this morning? I'm going to look about a little bit of some practicalities of underwriting, some complex cases, talk a little bit about temporary extra premiums versus permanent extra premiums, ethos of the different companies is quite important. I'm not going to say what companies have different ethos, but I can say each company that I go for has a different ethos with regard to underwriting and claims. And we'll come to that later. And then I'll talk about appeals from brokers and how you manage them. Okay, so every day I do a bit of underwriting for a couple of hours. I don't see all the cases. I will see the difficult, more complex cases, and I deal with most of the appeals. So inevitably, most days, a case has been declined, and either the individual is appealing it or the broker is appealing it, and those ones I always get to see. And sometimes I agree, and sometimes I think we've been a bit harsh, maybe it shouldn't be declined, and sometimes I say, well, look, let's look at them again in a year's time, and maybe they'll be better in a year's time when we look at it then. So it varies. So I would have to say appeals, yeah, we deal with them all the time. Sometimes I change my mind. Sometimes I've not seen the case before, and I think the underwriters were a bit harsh. And sometimes I think, yeah, we made the right decision, and we just go on from there. Okay, when we look at the life insurance industry, first off, simple life protection. If the rating ends up at 50% or less than 50%, we generally let it go at standard rates. Why? Because it costs too much to apply a loading. So if the loading works out at plus 40 or plus 35, you just let it go. By the time you would actually apply a loading, you're going outside of all your IT systems, it takes time, it's not worth it financially. So anything that's total sum assured is less than 50%, we let it go. So 50% by and large is the smallest loading you'd put on a life insurance policy. Anything less than that, you just wouldn't bother with it. If your rating goes up to plus 350, plus 400, my gut feeling is, nah, send it to the reassurers or decline it. It's just too risky for me. Irish companies are small. We're not in the market for really high-risk business. Let it go to somebody else. So that's my ethos. When it comes to income protection, we will apply loadings as low as plus 33. And if it goes over 150, I say no. Not interested, too risky business. I would have to say, however, for income protection underwriting, and it is more difficult than life insurance underwriting, which is scientific. Life insurance underwriting, you can get data from various studies, mortality, morbidity studies, and say, yeah, this is accurate, we're happy here. With income protection, it's the gut feeling that you get from reading about the number of attendances the individual's had with a general practitioner, what they've been with, and you get a feeling, is this a good risk or not? And so if it goes over 150, we're really not interested. And we use a lot of exclusions in income protection, and I'll look at those in a few minutes. With critical illness, and I will talk about critical illness in a few minutes, loadings will start again at plus 50, but if they go over 200, we generally say no. Okay. Exclusions are used in both critical illness and income protection. If you look at the three biggest causes of income protection claims, mental illness, 1/3. Orthopedic, backs, necks, shoulders, 1/3 of all claims. And everything else lumped together, cancer, heart disease, everything else you can think of, 1/3. So the big two are mental and backs. So if somebody applies for income protection and they've got a history of mental problems or back problems, you are taking them out. There is no way you're going to cover that sort of stuff because the risk of recurrence is really too high, so exclusions are the order of the day. One other thing I'll briefly mention, and that's cancers and mental illness. We underwrite them differently from pretty well all other conditions. Most conditions we underwrite which adversely affect mortality are cumulative and lifelong. So in other words, if you're diabetic, your mortality goes up the longer you're diabetic. If you've got heart disease, your mortality goes up or remains static while you've got heart disease. However, with mental illness and cancer, the excess mortality is early rather than late. So if you had a cancer 5 years ago, we'd say a testicular cancer, stage 1 teratoma or something like that, maybe even 3-4 years ago, and you've had treatment, you've made a full recovery, and you apply for a policy 3-4 years down the line, you'll probably get standard rates. If you apply for it 1 year down the line, you'll have a loading, but only for a short period of time. And once you've hit the cancer-free period, we let it go. So that's generally the difference between temporary extra premiums and permanent extra premiums. Interestingly enough, with mental illness, when you look at the excess causes of mortality, Most of the excess mortality associated with mental illness in the early days is suicide, but with significant mental illness, there's a huge increased risk in coronary artery disease. So temporary extra premiums are used less with mental illness now than they used to be because of the excess of coronary artery disease. Okay. Next thing is, when you underwrite a case, each case goes on its own merits. As I said earlier on, it's easier to offer standard rates than to apply rating. When I started in the industry, there used to be this thing, God, I think he's gone now, but one of the CMOs of Caledonian, gas character, always had this feeling of putting on a precautionary plus 50. And the precautionary plus 50 was, there's something here that I don't like, but I can't put my finger on it. Let's stick on a 50. That's kind of gone now, but that used to be there, and it was a big issue. In reality, what happens if you take 100 applicants for life insurance, they come in the door randomly, about 95% will get standard rates, 2, 3, 4% might be loaded, less than 1% are declined. So the declinature rate is pretty low, and the loading rate is pretty low by comparison to the totals. Serious illness. Serious illness takes up a lot more of my time than almost any other product, with maybe the exception of income protection. Income protection claims are very complicated, but serious illness as an underwriting product is complex. Even as a claim product, it's complex. Why is it complex? Well, it's complex because each company has its own critical illness policy. So you have to know, you go from one company to another every day to underwrite. You have to know, oh yeah, hold on, this company has all these policies and these definitions, and they're all important that you know which ones are different. And the problem is they change from week to week. You know, there's a new product out, a new one, and then you look at a claim and you say, okay, well, which series of claims was this? What product was this one? So the definitions change all the time, and sometimes for the better. Let me give you an example. In the early days of dread disease, as it was called, there were standard 8 products, and they were kind of standard across the industry, and it's fine, everybody had the same definition, and it was easy to manage. And then, to make companies more competitive, they started adding in all these extra conditions. And frankly, in the early days, those extra conditions, whilst they might have looked good, they weren't. Why weren't they? They were a bit like that coconut on the shy in the carnival. And even if they hit it big on with a ball, there's no way it was coming off. The definitions were such that it was almost impossible to make a successful claim. Let me give you an example. A lot of companies introduced a rheumatoid arthritis definition. So it wasn't the policy, it wasn't the name of the condition that was the issue, it was how it was defined. And rheumatoid arthritis was defined such that less than 0.5% of people who got rheumatoid arthritis wouldn't be able to make a successful claim. And that was a problem. Another issue, and this is one of the things where there's been a change recently, and I think for the better, and this is in relation to policy definition changes, which is huge, is take, I just saw a case yesterday, take Parkinson's disease. Now, Parkinson's disease has been a definition of one sort or another for the last 10, 12, 14 years. And I think prior to this year, despite having seen maybe 80 or 90 applicants for claim for Parkinson's disease, I think I've maybe seen 2 or 3 that met the definition. Because the definition usually said you had to be permanently supervised by another person, and almost nobody was. However, one of the newer definitions which I saw yesterday just said you had to have a clinical diagnosis of idiopathic Parkinson's disease with these symptoms, and once you had that, you got to pay the claim. So yesterday, for the first time under the new definition, I was able to pay a claim. I was kind of thrilled. I said, this is easy. I suppose one of the things you've got to bear in mind is that now that policy is, because claims are now easier to pay, it's going to be more expensive because there are going to be more claims. And one of the things that happened in the early days was keeping price down was such a big thing, they made all these definitions so that you could never claim on them. Or the conditions were so rare, you were never going to get them anyway. Anyway, let's move on. So what are the issues in critical illness? The two big sources of claim are still cancers and ischemic heart disease, and maybe as a third, MS. Family history is important for critical illness. Family history of cardiomyopathy, heart disease, or cancer. And we take all 3 significantly. and we're still allowed underwrite on the basis of family history. And regarding family history, we're really only talking about direct family members, parents, siblings. But if we're looking at cancers, we'll look to uncles, aunts, grandparents as well, because certain cancers tend to have more obviously run in families. A big issue for us really is genetics. The current genetic legislation is a disaster. The way the wording is phrased at the moment, if we get a letter in the door and open it up and it contains genetic information, by virtue of the fact that we've opened that letter, even though we didn't know what was in it before we opened it, we've broken the law. Ludicrous. The other big issue with genetics is that we're obliged to ignore any genetic information that we receive, good or bad. So if somebody's got a family history of Huntington's disease, we can make a determination based on the family history that maybe we could accept them, but we'll apply a loading of, say, plus 100%. Now, they then go and get a genetics test done, which turns out they're negative. They carry no risk. What do? We have to keep applying the loading because we must ignore the results of all genetic tests for the benefit or not of the client. That's the legislation, so that needs changing. We get sources of information from various different specialists. Just one of the stories that sticks in my mind from a year or two ago. We had an applicant for a guy for critical illness, and it was for life cover actually, and he told us he had minimal coronary artery disease, and the GP wrote us a letter saying he had the specialist wrote us a letter saying, this guy had very minor coronary artery disease. In fact, it is so mild he doesn't even require surgery or angioplasty. And we thought, okay, that sounds good. And then the GP sent us in a copy of the specialist report which said, this guy is so riddled, surgery won't do anything for him. The same client. Okay, I've been through that. How often do cases go legally? Rare. In the last 15 years, I've maybe been to court 20 times, given evidence only 5 times. And usually after the evidence is given, the case is usually withdrawn for some reason. So we've only had judgment by a judge twice in the 20 years that I've been involved in. Ombudsman cases, however, are quite common. Critical illness claims. Ethos. Ethos of a company is important. Some companies, they get a claim, even if it doesn't meet the definition. If it kind of meets the spirit of the definition, they'll pay. Other companies will say, nah, it's got to meet the letter of the definition, and they'll play hardball. And for me, I just learn what the ethos of the company is, and I apply it. I don't try and impart my own ethos into the particular company, but I can tell you that same claim going to 2 different companies when I'm the CMO, and you get 2 different decisions, because the ethos of the company is different. Main sources of claims: breast cancer, big source of claim; melanoma. Our biggest source of claim used to be coronary artery bypass grafting. If I've seen 2 cases in the last year, that's as many as I've seen. I used to see 2 or 3 cases a day, so that's disappeared. As angioplasties become far more common, infarct not that common, MS, quite a big source of claim. And to be honest, all the other sources of claim are pretty rare. So if you've got a critical illness policy with 150 cancer-covered conditions, I can tell you that 99% of them are going to fall into those 4. And maybe 1% of them will be all the rest. So they're the important ones, from my point of view. Okay, now, things to think about when you're looking at selling critical illness. The individual should be aware that just by having the diagnosis of the condition does not mean they're going to get paid. They must meet the definition of the condition, and the definitions are different than the general conditions. A classic example is rheumatoid arthritis. Clinicians have a diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis which requires 2 or 3 things to be present. The critical illness definition requires huge amounts of things to be present that are not required clinically. So a clinical diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis may be made, but does not meet severity criteria in the critical illness policy. So all I would say to you is, look, just be very careful about saying, look, these are all the covered conditions, because some of them are so worded that they're just not going to be a successful claim, whereas some of the newer wordings, frankly, are much better. Well, I will warn you, the newer wordings, which are much better, will enable claims to be made better, will probably cost more because there will be more claims. Where are our issues when it comes to underwriting claims or looking at claims? When heart disease cases, troponins are a bit of an issue. We always want cardiographs. This is for heart disease. The cancer ones which give us problems are bladder cancers, I'll explain why in a minute, carcinoid and borderline tumors. So the cancer definition requires that the cancer be invasive. Invasive is a histological term. It's a term that the histologist or the pathologist looks down a slide and determines whether invasion is present. And nearly all critical illness policies require that invasion is present. And in the absence of invasion, we don't pay. So bladder cancers are almost never invasive. They almost never kill anybody. So they almost never get paid. And it's bad publicity for the company. You always hate turning down claims, particularly when the guy is going to put up a big poster and stand outside your door marching backwards and forwards. But bladder cancer is very difficult to claim on a bladder cancer. Carcinoid means this thing looks like cancer, but it's not quite. And they're a problem for us. And then you've got these borderline tumors, these tumors which are, look a little bit malignant, but we're not really sure. And they're an issue for us. If they recur, they're obviously malignant, that's easy. But in the early stages, they're difficult. And we frankly have difficulty dealing with these. Stroke. For a stroke definition to be successful, you have to usually have permanent neurological deficit. So we often get independent examinations with neurologists to say, does this person have an impairment as a result of their stroke? And many don't. Now, this is where ethos comes in again. A lot of companies will say, even though it's in the definition, we let that go. If we're happy they've had a stroke, we'll pay. Other companies will say, no, they must fulfill the definition. Okay. Last few comments. What about multiple company applications? So Joe is diabetic and he's 52 and he's had a bit of retinopathy. And by and large, if he's looking for a policy, if I'm doing the medical examination on him, I know I'm going to be doing 5 or 6 pieces of paper for different companies. And is there so he'll be spread out every underwriting department will have a look at him. Does it make a difference if I'm the CMO of all the companies that I'm looking at? Yeah, it does, because the basic rates may be different. The likelihood is that my opinion will be the same in each case that I see, but various different companies may take a view and let it go at a lesser rate to get the business, and others may not. And that's down to the individual company. Appeals by brokers, appeals by individuals. So in other words, an individual has been declined or turned down or been loaded. How do I respond to an appeal? Look for a second opinion. Well, first times I may not have seen the case the first time around. It might be my first time looking at it, but I can by and large be fairly certain that I would see nearly all the appeals from either brokers or individuals on declines or loadings. What I try to do when I'm looking at an appeal is not look at the decision I made the first time and see how close I get to it the second time. Sometimes with an appeal I'm getting more information so I can make a more accurate decision. Sometimes it's really just looking at it again, and sometimes I say to myself, I was a bit harsh the first time. I'm feeling better about it today. Sometimes I say, fuck, what was I thinking of? This is much worse. So you never know, but by and large, I'm fairly static. And I don't mind appeals. I always enjoy looking at them again and see how close I got to it the first time round. The AOR is gone. That's the old association registry. Only the old guys here will probably remember that. But the association registry was a registry whereby if you ever applied for life insurance or had a loading or a declinature, your name was put on this thing. And the first thing when a name came in for an applicant, you looked up and see if they're on the registry. And if you did, it was a problem for them. Anyway, that's gone. Probably no harm. Timing of an application is important. If the applicant applies following a disease and they're applying 2 or 3 years post-disease, we might be more cautious. If they're applying 5 or 6 years post-onset of disease, we get a much better idea of what the pattern of the disease is and what the mortality is likely to be like. So, a loading that we'd apply early on after disease, it's not that we'd review it, but if they applied again 4 or 5 years later, it might be a lot less. We'd have a much better idea what's going on. There was one other thing I was going to say. Fuck, I can't remember. Okay.
Questions? I think it's safe to say that the life insurance companies are going to get a few appeals in next week for decisions from the last couple of years, so good luck with that one. Sorry, I should have said earlier on, we have got a texting app. We'll show you the information now. We have mics for questions for Dr. Gueret, but in future, while it's going on, I usually say keep your phones off, but today we want you to keep them on silent. So two options: go to isay.ie and log in with just ClearChoice, all lowercase, or else you can text if you want to put the number in. It's 087 145 2044. You must put in ClearChoice space and then your question. Just try and get us to get through questions as quickly as possible during the day. But we have mics around the room for anyone that has questions for Paul. Please don't bring up previous cases. We won't get through them.
I don't mind. I won't remember.
Any questions? Great. Nikki, if you don't mind, just wait for the mic if that's okay. Shout, yeah.
Thank you. Very good presentation. In relation to income protection, now maybe this is not your area, but you say obviously someone with a back injury, it's excluded, right? The companies don't seem to reduce premium as a consequence of that. No. And why is that? I mean,
that's a very good question, and that's come up before. It has come up, strangely enough, not at the income protection front, but in the critical illness front. But it's the same problem. And I think the main reason is, I think the main reason they don't is because it's too complicated to do so. But cancer as an exclusion in critical illness, this is where it comes up before. Somebody's had a past history of cancer for critical illness and they're applying for critical illness policy. You say, okay, look, we're either going to decline them or offer them cover with the cancer exclusion. Now, if you put on a cancer exclusion, that's a third of the cost gone. So you say, well, maybe the cost should be gone. It never disappears. Now, I can't explain why, but I'm told by the underwriters and by those who do all that kind of stuff, it's just too complicated to do. Under fair contracts and unfair contract terms, it may be something that ultimately we will have to do. But at the moment, that doesn't happen. I can't really explain why, but I know it's very complicated to do so.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Sign of a great presentation. Anyone else? Going once? There's one text. Great, we have a text. We had a text. Given the variety in potential illnesses, how can any broker be sure of the recommendation to a client of a particular product or company? Woo.
This is a critical illness.
Yeah, there's no critical illness, yep.
You can't be. Put it this way. I would read a lot of critical illness policies. And, okay, the core 8 are fairly standard across the industry. They're your heart attack, your stroke, your angioplasty, your benign brain tumor, your total permanent disability. They're fairly standard and they're accepted. And there's really no difference between them. And they account for 95, 99% of all your claims. When it comes to all the rest of them, you can get an advice from a doc is one that you could do and say, look, how likely is this claim to be paid based on this definition? What I can say is some of the ones that would never have been paid in the past, or almost never, like Parkinson's disease, the one I mentioned earlier on, are now much more likely to be paid. But there are other ones that I've never seen paid as well. Systemic lupus erythematosus, SLE, is down in a lot of them, and I think I've seen it paid once because it requires you have brain, heart, or kidney involvement, which is rare. So I wouldn't, when you're selling the product, I wouldn't hugely rely on the smaller definitions unless the individual has a particular concern. And if they have a particular concern about a condition A, and this is why they want this policy because condition A is covered, you could say, well, look, these are the various definitions of definition A in across the industry and see which one you like the best. But it's not straightforward. It's not straightforward.
Great. I have one, just quickly, the latest procedure more. Sick, income protection, or specified illness cover? Which would you go with? We're going to have a debate on this later on, but Dr. Gueret can't stay around for it, so thought we'd get the question out now.
It's a very good question. Well, okay, I'm a trainer doctor, so I have always got a trainee working with me, and I always advise them to get income protection. Okay, personally, I always advise them to get income protection. If they can't get income protection, I attempt to get critical illness. If you're over the age of 40, very hard to get income protection, so they get critical illness. So it depends kind of on what you want. Personally, but it's a personal view, I took out an income protection policy when I was 23, and I've had the same policy ever since. And I've never had a claim on it, of course. But
I know a good CMO if you do that.
but by and large, if you have a genuine medical complaint and you're genuinely unwell, you'll be paid your income protection. So I've always, that would be my personal plan. Now, it was always been around a lot longer than critical illness. And critical illness, you see, the problem with it is most people who claim under income protection go out with back problems, not covered by critical illness.
Yeah.
A third go out with mental illness, not covered by critical illness. Yeah. Now, all the other things, only a third of them are all the other conditions together, and that's where all your critical illness comes in. So my issue with critical illness as a product in that sense, is it better than income protection? I don't think it is, because you're only really looking at a third of the conditions that could cause you to become disabled. Personal viewpoint.
Great. Okay, there you have it. Thank you very much. Round of applause, thanks. Great.